Hi, everybody. My name is Masao Suzuki. I'm a member of the Freedom Road Socialist organization, and I teach economics for my livelihood. It's not really the topic of today, but my semester starts in 2 weeks, so I have to get all tuned up for what's going on in the economy. So let's stick to that, not talk about work. Big news, two pieces of new economic news over the last week, two big ones, and then there's others, of course. I mean, the first big one, of course, is that the $600 a week addition to unemployment insurance benefits has expired. And so already people will start getting their smaller checks, which only average nationwide about $350 a month. And for lower paid workers, or in many states, it can even be a lot less than that. So the extra $600 a month really allowed about 2/3 of those who are getting benefits to almost equal their past pay, and has really reduced the economic pain that they felt. Really allowed about 2/3 of those who are getting benefits to their livelihood. And so this is in fact the biggest news. And unfortunately, I have, unless a miracle happened, maybe someone can do a film, Miracle in the Capitol. Unless a miracle happened, talks between the Trump administration and the House are still deadlocked. And there's a big gap between what the Trump administration and Republicans want and what the Democrats want. So some of the things that have already run out is the $600 a week in extra unemployment benefits. There also was a federal eviction moratorium on apartments that either were under a federal program like Section 8, or whose landlord had federally backed mortgages. And so this actually covered up to 1/3 of all renters. And so this is actually something else that's going to be a big issue, because one of the things that's happened is in June and May and even April, a lot of people who you would think, with the unemployment rate being what it is with 20 million jobs lost, wouldn't have been able to pay their rent. But actually, the increase in people who weren't able to pay their rent was relatively small because of that additional benefit. And of course, that's going to go away. So you're going to see a lot of people not being able to pay their rent or pay their mortgage in August. And you're going to see even more attempts at landlords trying to, evict people who, through no fault of their own, have lost their jobs, and, where are they going to go? And so one of the things that also we have not seen a big significant rise in homelessness, but again, that is also unfortunately on the table. I think the other piece of news, which seemed to be small, but it was actually probably significant, is just last Thursday, the report on new unemployment claims came in, and for the second week in a row, they increased. And these were the first increases in the unemployment insurance benefit claims applications since March. And so this is another sign that the economy is starting to weaken. And of course, the reason behind that is the continued spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. It spread to all parts of the country, and actually it's increasing in most states. And last week, there were record highs in new cases. And now what we're seeing, because there's a lag, is big increases in deaths from COVID-19. And it seems to be rolling along the first cases we're seeing here on the West Coast. In fact, my county, I think, has the first confirmed case of COVID-19 way back in early February, and then it epicenter turned to New York City and around there, New Jersey, Connecticut, lesser degree Massachusetts, and then it's moved to the south, and you saw these huge increases in Florida and Texas, Arizona being among the worst, and now it's also rising in the Midwest and areas that had not seen an increase for a while. And so the virus, unfortunately, is spreading, and it's causing people to pull back on going out to eat or doing activities outside the home. And it's also in different localities, the government has been acting to limit indoor activities. So I know the neighboring county of mine, right north of San Jose, all the indoor businesses, indoor services that had been allowed to reopen briefly had to close down again. And so this is taking a toll on jobs and people's livelihoods. So there's a lot of, I think, economic stress right now, from people losing that additional benefit, to people facing evictions, to businesses, especially small businesses, closing down, but also some large businesses. I actually am not familiar with them because their stores are, I think they're upscale, but Lord and Taylor, which is evidently the country's oldest department store, just filed for bankruptcy. And so the drumbeat of bankruptcy filing continues. I'm trying to think, another thing, which was a big, it hit the headlines really hard. And I know a lot of people asked about it. I guess I was a little bit, I had been expecting it. I think most professional economists have been expecting it, but I need to go off of what people are concerned about, and not just what I is already a little older news to me. But of course, if you've been reading the headlines last week, the gross domestic product, which is the broadest measure of all the goods and services produced in the United States, fell at almost a 1/3 annual rate. And so this is by far the worst 3 months. This would have been for the second quarter, or April, May, and June of this year. This is the worst in recorded history. Some economic historians who do estimates, I read one estimate that said, well, I think there was a 3-month period in 1875 that might have been worse than that. But that's an estimate, and that's 145 years ago. It's a long time. So it is worse than any 3-month period during the Great Depression. So that is an unprecedented historical fall. And one thing I do want to note, if any of you read my article, I actually used the quarter-to-quarter figure. Now, the annualized figure is the standard measurement of gross domestic product, or GDP, and that's how we usually report it. So it's nothing unusual to report it that way. But I use the smaller figure because the annualized figure basically says what happened, what would happen if the economy continued in the same way for an entire year. So it wasn't mean just that we locked down for months, weeks back in March, but then we continued to expand the lockdown, throughout a whole year, and that's obviously not a very real projection. Or, as I tried to explain to a friend, it's like, well, if you, like some people who I won't mention, but you're probably looking at them right now, gained 5 pounds during April to June period, but at an annualized rate, you gain 20 pounds. If I went around saying, well, I gained 20 pounds at an annualized rate, someone, if they're nice, will say, oh, Masao, you don't look that different. I'm like, thank you. But it's actually because I only gained 5 pounds from staying at home. So anyway, so on a quarter-to-quarter basis compared to the first 3 months, the economy shrank by about 9.5%, which is still, it's still the same historically massive shrinkage in the economy. So I think that's the top of the news. As things come up, I will get back to other factors. Oh, well, I should mention one other not good sign is the applications is one number. That's just the number of people applying for unemployment benefits. Is another number, which is a week older. So the applications number comes from the week ending July 25th. And then a week before, ending July 18th, you have the total number of people actually collecting unemployment benefits. So there's a difference there between the people who are getting it and people who apply. And the week before, on July 18th, the number of people actually receiving unemployment insurance benefits also went up by a small amount. But this is another factor. And then also the federal government's long-term supplement to unemployment insurance payments, because the usual typical state will only pay about 6 months of unemployment benefits. And so this federal benefit kicks in an additional 3 months when your state one runs out, and that's running across all 50 states, all 50 states. And there's actually a big increase in that that program. 115,000 more people joined that program, meaning their regular unemployment benefits had run out. They must have gotten unemployed right before the pandemic started, and then they ran out in July. And so that's another sign that jobs are not coming back. I think I'll try and turn to some of the questions. And let me actually, I noticed one question that's a little unclear, so maybe the person asking the question could reword it. The question goes, and then I'm going to go on to another question I can answer. Services shut down, do you think there'll be a push for privatization? And so maybe if the person can be a little more explicit about what exactly they're talking about. I can take a stab, but I might be answering the wrong question. But another question is, well, let's start with the first one is, what are their protest tactics that people facing eviction can do? So I should just, you should take any answer of mine with a grain of salt, because I did work on anti-eviction stuff in the late 70s. So that's a little while ago. And the evictions were actually being carried out by the government, which is a little bit different because it's easier to make it obviously a public issue and mount a campaign to stop the government from doing that. This was the redevelopment, government-backed redevelopment effort in the Japanese American community of Little Tokyo down in Los Angeles, California. So what's going on today is not government mandated. It's not a redevelopment project, but it's the what's happening is as millions of people fall behind on the rent, then landlords are starting to issue eviction notices. So there's one thing which I'm a little more familiar with, and if it's possible, is that there were local and even statewide eviction moratoriums that went in back in March during the height of the crisis. So I know here in California, actually I think it was the association or decision-making body for state judges decided basically, oh, we're not going to do eviction cases. It was basically defer all eviction cases for 3 or 4 months, which means the landlords, if they can't go to court and get an eviction notice, then they can't call the police or the sheriff or whoever and forcibly evict you. So that was that. Anyway, that was a good thing, but I have no idea how that happened. But I also know that local governments also passed eviction moratoriums. And so I think that's something to explore, because then you can make a public campaign about it, and it applies basically to everybody. It's not necessarily easygoing, because one of the things I've found in my experience is that, I mean, I think most of you watching me know that money plays a big role in elections, and at the local level, the big money that I see is real estate interests, not just landlords, but also developers, um, contractors, et cetera. And so it's not going to be an easy slog. I think in terms of for on an individual basis, my only advice is to try and, if you can, to see if there's a local housing or tenant or an eviction committee and ask for help there. If you're in a larger apartment complex, you can also try and talk to your neighbors and see if any of them are under the same threat, because sometimes, I mean, more and more of the rental industry is being concentrated in the hands of a few large landlords. So you may be able to make a public target out of that. And of course, the last thing, which is not easy if you don't have money to pay the rent, is if you have a good lawyer, that never hurts for legal proceedings. But that's sort of like, well, if I had money for a lawyer, I think I'd just pay the rent. So I know that's not probably a very practical solution. There's an interesting question here. It says, saw that California was considering expanding benefits. So what that means is the state of California, at least the governor, said that he would be exploring the possibility of the state issuing the additional $600 a month. And the only part of that I don't really know if it's feasible is the governor of California, was planning to borrow the money from the federal unemployment fund. Because what happens, because unemployment is underfunded in almost every state in the country. Here in California, which is really the only one I know about, the unemployment is paid by a payroll tax, sort of like Social Security or Medicare you would have seen as a deduction, but it actually only is paid by the employer. But here in California, whereas the so let's say Social Security limit for income is about $120,000 a year, here in California, the income limit on taxation is $7,000 a year, which is way below even a minimum wage job. And the reason is that taxation limit was set in the 1960s, and it's never been raised since. So the employer pays the tax based on the number of employees the business has, but the tax assumes that you're paying all of them $7,000 a year. So it's way too low. So it's underfunded. So every recession, the state runs out of money, and then they borrow it from the federal government. So I'm not sure if that's practical, but if your state is willing to try and do that, I think that would be a good stopgap measure, at least to keep them going. But I think the main thing is to try and put pressure on Congress. And so, especially if you live in a district which has a Republican congressperson, which I don't, then I think it would be really useful to try and mount a campaign to do that. Let's see. But in the long run, it's not a good strategy, because what you really need is the federal government to basically try and do that. That's their job. And in fact, I think the federal government should basically federalize the state unemployment at a basic level and just pay all of it. Because the problem is every time there's a recession, the states end up running out of money because they can't borrow. Generally, they're not supposed to borrow except for projects like construction, land acquisition for parks or roads or bridges or things like that. And so it really restricts their ability to support services that are really needed during a recession. So there's thank you for clarifying it, question. The US Postal Service and other government services seem to be closing down. Do you think the private sector will take these over? Well, I know more about the US Postal Service. I don't know that much about other government or federal government services. I think what's happening with the US Postal Service is there's a new Trump appointee to head the Postal Service, and what he did recently was he banned overtime in the post office, which meant that a lot of packages, not packages, but mail is getting really slowed down because, as you can imagine, along with UPS and FedEx, the private carriers, there's a lot more actual stuff going through the mail than there was before. And there's definitely a slowdown in the mail delivery. And there's different theories on why this might be happening, from a deep-seated right-wing opposition to any kind of universal government services like the post office. And so in that sense, the alternative would be more and more for private services. There's also the possibility that Trump is trying to undermine the November election because more and more places are going to an all-mail ballot, which some places have done for a long time. My city did it before the pandemic ever hit. And basically Trump's stuff about mail fraud and all that stuff, that's just it's just made up. It's stuff that he likes. If you believe that, then don't worry, the virus is going to go away soon, very soon, maybe next week. And I'm paraphrasing something that Trump actually said back in February. There's probably both aspects. I would think that given Trump's thinking and his focus on trying to stay in office no matter what, the latter is probably more the case. But I should just note that the one downside of I think it's a minor downside, is that it often will take a little bit longer for results to come in because the ballots just have to be postmarked by election day. And so it might take 2 or 3 days for all the ballots to actually reach the counters. And so you can see many cases where the final results will be backed up a few days. And for some people who are expecting instant outcomes, that might be a little frustrating, but it's really not. To me, it's not a huge deal. Divisions in the ruling class between city, state, and federal levels, and how organizers should pick their battles. Some groups are targeting Congress members to get expanded unemployment. Others are focusing on local or state government for eviction moratorium, benefits, etc. Well, I really think that it is an important tactic. It's not a strategy, but it's an important tactic, I think, of any people's movement, is to be able to take advantages between differences among the ruling class. For example, a longstanding difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Or there's differences now emerging or coming to the surface more and becoming more public within the Republican Party, more opposition to Trump. And it's important to try and decide on, well, what's your main target, and to try and unite all that can be united against them. Now, ideally, in a situation, the movement should be able to do all of these things because they're all important. I think the unemployment benefits are definitely important, probably to the largest numbers of people. The disadvantage of focusing on that, like if you're in a Democratic district, as I am, in fact, it's sort of the whole Bay Area, I think, is, I'd be hard pressed. I'd have to go a couple hundred miles to find a Republican congressperson. There are 7 left in California, but they're not that many. And so it's hard to be actually active in that struggle, aside from raising it as a general demand and a general protest. Doesn't mean that's sort of what I'm focused on, because I try and look at the national situation. And then in terms of eviction battles, those also can be more important. But again, it also somewhat depends on where you are, where you live. So if you live in a neighborhood, as I do, sometimes I refer to it as the wrong side of town, which is almost, my street is almost entirely homeowners, and some of the renters aren't working class either. They just chose not to buy. It's the eviction battle is not a real near thing, but there's a lot of communities that are facing evictions, and that's where I think you have to try and investigate the situation, learn from people who have been doing eviction organizing, and I think very importantly, it's probably a combination of getting to know the actual families that are facing eviction and how to help them in their cases, but also to try and get local or even statewide moratoriums on evictions expanded or extended, because there were a lot earlier on, and so that's something that can be addressed. And I think the important thing actually is for you as an individual to be able to try and focus your organizing efforts, because I think I'm not saying there isn't talented individuals with time, which maybe there's more. It's not they're more talented individuals, but there might be more people with time who could take up a bunch of different causes at a time. But I do feel trying to focus your effort, not to be single-minded, but to focus your effort allows you to be, as an individual, to pick a group or a campaign that you can maximize your contributions to a collective effort. Let's see, one more question. Do you think states will have uneven economic growth since the spread of COVID-19 has been so uneven? Well, yes and no. One of the things is that the spread, while it's uneven, it's sort of breaking out like everywhere. And of course, it's worse in some places than other places, but it's hard to find places that there aren't any. So, for example, in California, I think there's like 54 counties. And up until recently, there was only one county, which was a small county. It was in the northeast corner, bordering Nevada and Oregon, that did not have a COVID case. And I think I heard they have a case, or they're investigating a case. And the problem is there's been analysis that if you find one case in a community, the odds are at least 50% that the virus is spreading in your community. And so we've just found the tip of the iceberg. And so it is spreading everywhere. I think the unevenness of the impact is going to be probably rather than by the area, directly by the area, but what kind of economic activity is going on. So for example, the area that was hardest hit even before the pandemic became widespread or even widespread in that state was actually Florida. Why? Because Florida, of the large states, has the probably the single biggest travel and flight and entertainment and tourist industry outside of Hawaii, but Hawaii is not a large state. Sorry about that, but it's not. Uh, Florida has at least 20 times as many people. And so that was hit the hardest, despite the fact that they didn't have a statewide shutdown and they didn't have that many cases, but people just weren't up to flying or taking vacations or things like that. And so I think the areas that are reliant on travel and tourism and restaurants and hotels are going to be harder hit, especially if they're counting on out of state. Well, a lot of them do, because just the amount of travel, yeah, I think, is not going to recover for quite a while. So, like right now, one of the places that actually has even worse hit in terms of percentage-wise, but again, it's not a real big state, population-wise, is Nevada, because people are not flying there and going to casinos and so forth. Because even if to the extent casinos open up, a lot of people just don't think it's a big gamble. You know, you go there to gamble, but then you want to gamble with your life. Well, some people, it's like, sure, I'll just double down. But a lot of people a lot less people are going. So I think there will be regional state differences, but I think it's going to be more by the type of industries that are dominant in the state, and a little bit less than just the overall numbers, because I think they're looking pretty bad everywhere. One of the big questions, and there's some at least encouraging partial evidence. Again, I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not up on the latest studies on COVID-19, but I know there's at least one study suggesting that public transport is not a major cause of infection. And so this would actually be really good news for some of the big cities, especially the so-called older cities, not so much based on cars, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, where there's a lot of public transport. And so that would actually be good news. While we're on the COVID, although I'm not an expert, I mean, one of the things that we'll see happening, expected to start dominating the news, is a lot of places, a lot of schools are going to try and reopen. And I think, you know, part of the thing, there's a lot of emphasis on cleaning. And the thing is, while it's theoretically possible to get the coronavirus off a surface, it's actually not a common event. It's more of a theoretical possibility. And the main way you get COVID-19 is from breathing the air that someone else has already breathed, especially indoors. And so I think, and there are studies that show that for older kids aged 10 to 19, they emit just as many virus particles as adults. And so even though they're not that hard hit, there have been, here in California, we have the largest number of cases in the country, but we've had less than a handful of deaths under the age of 18. So while it is safer for the kids, almost all the kids are going home to adults. And so if they bring it back from school and they transmit it to their parents, or some of them even grandparents, or if they have older parents, it's going to be a real problem. And there's a number, again, I think that there's going to be schools that open up, and either through a combination of hard work, social distancing, and getting lucky, don't have any outbreaks. But there's going to be other cases, like there's a recent case of a summer camp in Georgia, where like 250 students, about a third of all the campers got infected, even though they screened everybody when they came in. Someone got in, and then within days, it had spread like wildfire through the camp. And I think just the problems we see, for example, in mainly in the baseball, which did not go into a bubble like basketball, and is trying to carry out limited flights. I mean, there have been a number of teams where they've had outbreaks and had to cancel games and series. And in fact, I think the whole season is in jeopardy. And if you can't get adults to, take extra precaution but be in close quarters and be safe from the infection, then I really don't see it possible for school children. But the other thing I should add to that is there is evidence that kids under 10 don't emit as many viruses. So we'll see. And I do know here in our state, we'll see how it goes. You can ask me about it. I've been past childcare age for 20 years. Yes, no, I'm talking about my daughter. So they are going to start reopening all the childcare, and many of them have been operating. I didn't realize this since right after the pandemic started, and so it hasn't been that bad. So that might provide some relief for people. Let's see, all I could say, maybe it's an advertisement, check back with me possibly next week. This coming Friday is a big day. It's the monthly employment report for July. And so we will see how it goes. And then the day before, on Thursday, again, we'll get the weekly report on unemployment insurance. I think the employment report is going to be a little limited because the employment report comes from the week that has the 12th of the previous month in it. So it doesn't have the latter half of the month, but it will give, unlike the unemployment applications, we can get a sense of how is it hitting African-American workers and Latino workers who have been hit the hardest. How is it hitting men and women and people with different educational levels and things like that, because they do break down a lot of that. We'll be able to get an update on the different industries, et cetera. And so in that sense, one can sort of answer the question about the uneven growth or uneven impact a lot better on Friday. So anyway, I can't promise you another show next weekend. It'll depend on my host. But until then, I will be keeping close track of the news, and you can check out my articles. I write I've been writing weekly or more on the Fight Back News website. And if any of you are interested finding out more about the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, you can just go to the FRSO website at FRSO.org/join, and then we'll have information, because I'll just leave it for those of you who follow the pandemic and the economy. That's what this is supposed to be about, is that way back in the beginning, I don't know if you mentioned that some folks, not me, some folks were talking about a V-shaped recovery, quick bounce back, and that obviously has not happened. We recovered about a 1/3 of the jobs that were lost early on, but since then things have really sort of stalled out. Unfortunately, the pandemic is worse than ever. But if you look at the socialist countries, they've done a lot better job in trying to suppress the virus. If you look at the existing socialist countries, China, Cuba, Laos, the DPRK or North Korea, and then Vietnam, they've all done a lot better. And I'm really only familiar with China's economy. They have what's closer to a V-shaped recovery. It hasn't quite recovered yet, but it's bounced back quite a bit. And this is just a little side note for the tech war that the US is trying to wage against China, but the dreaded Huawei company has now, in the second quarter, in the April through June quarter, is the number one cell phone seller in the world. And this is not because of anything, dramatic on Huawei's part. It's just that Huawei has a very heavy exposure to China. It's a Chinese company. 75% of their sales come from China, and versus Samsung, which has long been the number one cell phone maker in the world. It's a South Korean company, but they don't actually have many sales in China. And so their main big sales markets, especially United States and Europe, were hit really hard. Economies were really hit really hard. And then, so Samsung has lost its first place, at least temporarily. And then the number three company is Apple. And Apple, again, it's not because of anything amazing they've done, but they also have actually a large market. They don't have a huge market share in China, but it's a big chunk of their total sales. And so that's allowed Apple to maintain its number three standing. All right, sorry I deviated a little bit. Check out my articles on Fight Back News. Check out FRSO at frso.org/join, and hopefully see you next week. Bye.